Thank you so much for coming. I know the question on your mind is why is there a rock in the art museum? And it's going to take me a while to get there to the rock part. Um, the reason I was motivated to do this is several things. I was asked by Classical Conversations to write a book for their class that I teach called Western Cultural History, and I've been teaching that class for this is my fourth or fifth year, I can't even remember. So I've enjoyed teaching the class, and I got to do all the research about the artists, and the book came together and it came out. And last year, I don't know if you realized, last year we had a lot of school shootings and tragedies happen, and I teach 15-year-olds. So one morning I'm driving to school after a shooting had happened the day before, and I'm listening to the radio, and everybody's shouting out the thing that they think will fix the problem that's causing these things to happen. And one person said, it's not that, it's a culture problem. And all of a sudden my class got a whole lot more important. If the problem is culture, we need to really think about culture and why these things are happening. So let's go back to the original rock stars, the ancient Egypts. Now, ancient Egypt isn't normally included in a Western cultural history because we didn't take a lot of ideas from them. But I wanted to show you this. This is what they were doing with rocks. This is a monument for their pharaoh to be buried in, so it's pointing to the sky. It's about the most sturdy structure that they could handle that's going to stand at that high at that time. And then this is the kind of art that they were drawing, and I want you to look at their feet right there. See how his feet are pointing to the side? They either didn't know how to draw feet or they didn't want to draw them any other way. Some people think that they believe that what they drew would be what comes alive after they die. So if they only drew one leg, they would get to heaven with only one leg. Now, this theory breaks down because they only draw one side of the face. So they're going to get to heaven like Picasso, man. So I'm not sure I buy all that. But the other thing you can see in this piece of artwork is their gods. So they would make their gods were kind of half man, half animal. So you've got the guy on the right there with that wolf head. So this is how they imagine their gods to be. So when a culture makes up a god with either man-made gods, they don't last long. So the culture of ancient Egypt and those gods did not last that long. The other thing you get when you make up your gods is that you can make up, well, Pharaoh is kind of like a god, and then you can convince people that Pharaoh is a god. So civilization built on man being God is not going to last long, and this ancient Egyptian culture is not with us today. So that's what happened to them, among other things. Let's turn our attention to ancient Greece, and this is what they were building to their gods, also pointing to the sky. See the triangle at the top? But they invented these beautiful columns. So this is the temple to their gods, and we can also study the sculpture that they had. They were excellent at sculpture. Not so good at feet yet, though. See, there's no feet. Sometimes they show up with feet. She does not have her feet showing either. But they really mastered sculpture. They were probably really good at painting. We don't know. It didn't last. So we have to look at sculpture. They may have even painted their sculpture too. Some historians think maybe they were very colorful too. But this is what we think of. I'm showing you this now because it's going to come up again several more times. So take a good look at her. That's ancient Greece. So the Romans conquered Greece. They came in and they said, we really like your artwork. I just wish it looked a little more like me. So he had them make them look more like Caesar. So we get a little bit more military style, but still see the draping fabric. They took that from the Greeks. They were really good at taking what they liked from other cultures. So they took some of their gods, they took some of their art. But again, it's a culture built on not the one true God, but built on gods that were really just big men. And they had the same kind of issues that we have. Big men and big women who live on Mount Olympus. Those were their gods. So that culture didn't last either. There's a lot of speculation on what happened to them. Could have been taxes, could have been slavery, could have been the lead in the water in the aqueducts. But the civilization began to fall apart. Francis Schaeffer will say it fell apart because they built their civilization based on man's ideas, not the truth, and that just can't stand to pressure. So he uses the illustration of a Roman bridge. You can stack up some rocks and get them placed just right, and it can hold a horse and carriage, but it can't take a 15-ton trailer going over it. It can't stand up to the pressures. And a civilization built on these man-made gods again couldn't stand up to the pressure. So it crumbled. And then we enter a period that some people call the Dark Ages. So the next question I'm sure you're wondering is, was it really dark? And in some ways, they didn't have electricity, so yes, it was dark at night. That much is true. You had a little candle, so that was not good. And you didn't have an iPad or a telephone, if you can imagine. So in some ways, it would have been dark for you guys. But here is some of the artwork that you might have seen. And this is a Berlinguero, if you're in my class, or have been in my class, or in any challenge too, you know this piece. So some of the things that you'll notice, and the question that comes up is, why is that baby so ugly? And it's not just this one. There's a lot of ugly babies in the Middle Ages. Mary also is not the Mary that we imagine. We imagine this young, beautiful girl, and she's got my husband's nose right there. That is a Chris Sanford nose. And look at those fingers. That is not right. And I don't think it's because they didn't know how to draw them, but they chose to draw them in such a way that you didn't get wrapped up in thinking, what a beautiful baby, or what a beautiful woman. They painted these so that you would focus on spiritual things. So this was kind of like an aid to prayer. It's a call to worship. See how the background, if you could see the real thing, it would be very beautiful because they used actual gold. So they would like pound real gold onto the backgrounds there. So the gold reminds you of heaven. Imagine the streets of gold. You can also make out this circle around her head, and that's around Jesus. They put that around the saints and around Jesus. And what you can tell about their worldview is that they valued God. They put God way up high on the scale of value. So when I do this, I was like, they value it really highly, and if they don't value it, it's really low. I have to explain my hand motions. I also put a map up here because when I talk about the world, I tend to point to imaginary maps, and I can't stop. So I put the map up there so I wouldn't look so silly. So I may point to that later. So they didn't want you, they weren't trying to make her look lifelike because they really thought that your body and all fleshy things and the things of the earth were a distraction from what you should be thinking about, which was the spiritual things. So they're trying to take your mind off of who you are. So they really thought that your body was bad. This is why you had monasteries. They would leave society and go be set apart so that you could be more holy. It was more holy to be set apart, and earthly things were bad. So sometimes you got to see Mary and the baby Jesus posed in different ways, slightly, very slightly. Now they didn't sign these because they were more like craftsmen. Like if you built a stone wall, you wouldn't sign the stone wall. So it's the same idea. They were making these things, they were churning them out. They were making slight changes, but it wasn't about self-expression. It was about creating something for the church to help people to worship. Sometimes we see Jesus with other guys, so it's not just the two, but there were a lot of these. If you Google that, you're going to see millions of them. And a lot of them were destroyed. There's still a lot that survived. They also were painting for an illiterate society. They didn't really care if you read. The sermons were in Latin, and the Bible was read in Latin, and they didn't really speak Latin. So the pictures were a big help. So this is kind of some storytelling going on in the pictures. So that really helped out a lot. This is another thing they were doing. The monks knew how to read and write. And so in the monasteries, they were illuminating texts and they were copying. And so I would have done one of these. If I had to copy the Bible every day, all day long, you'd probably see me doodling in the margins too. So they just gave it a fancy word. If you have a fancy word for it, it makes it more spiritual. So this is illuminations. These are they illuminated the Bible. And what they lacked in painting skill, they made up for in architecture. They nailed it. These cathedrals are called lace in stone because they got all these details right. and they were very, very detailed and beautifully designed. And that's what it looked like on the inside. So this is what makes me think the Dark Ages is an inappropriate term for this time period. So I call it the Middle Ages, not the Dark Ages, because if you went in that building, you would feel it would really make you think about heaven. So this is a really huge ceiling, and it's light and airy, and it would just transport you away from everyday life, and you would not think about the field you had to till, or the chores you had to do, or the fact that you don't have electricity. I guess they weren't worried about it since they'd never had it. But this would transport you away. They were not designed for you to be able to see the pastor. They were built in the shape of a cross. So if you sit there, you can't, it's not at all like what our churches are like today. They didn't care whether you could see. They cared about the symbolism of you being in a space shaped like a cross and being transported to a heavenly kind of spiritual space. And I don't know how they did it. They did this without a crane or a crew, or it's just amazing how they did that. So I call it the Middle Ages, and I think it would have been amazing. So the Middle Ages did last a very long time. When Rome fell, Rome kind of began to deteriorate. It got weaker and weaker, and then the Goths and the Visigoths and the Vandals came in and took over, turned it into a bad neighborhood, kind of like Chicago. You just don't go in there, it's not safe. And they also destroyed the aqueducts, which was really dumb. So there's no water in there either. So it crumbled, and then it began to get just buried in dirt because nobody went in there. You couldn't live there. So all that great architecture that they had, and the great statues were forgotten about. And our focus turned more to Northern Europe, where we had the cathedrals being built, and the people in general were pretty poor. They didn't read and write. And there's a guy named Giotto. It's spelled Gitto or Giotto. It's not spelled at all like you would think. So if you see a guy with a G, I'm talking about Giotto. It sounds like it's spelled with a J. So Giotto, the story goes that he was coloring on rocks, and an artist went by and saw the rocks that he had colored on and was like, wow, you are an amazing artist. You must come with me and I will train you to be an artist. I don't know if that's true, but that's the story we tell. And the thing that Giotto did was that he made his subjects look a little bit more alive. So remember Mary, who just sat there with the long nose and those weird fingers? She just sat there. She didn't do anything. But Giotto made his people come alive. See how these people are moving? They're reacting to what's going on. The angels are flying. They definitely feel despair over Christ there. And they're not on a gold background anymore. They're on earth. So you actually have a tree and some rocks. So this was huge. This was like a technological breakthrough, and people were amazed. And so for years and years after this, everybody copied Giotto. He was the master. Things moved slowly back then. Didn't have Twitter, didn't have Facebook, couldn't just tweet out what you wanted to say. And things moved slow, but eventually the ideas caught on that, Jesus came to earth and got in a body. So how could bodies be all that bad? And they begin to think about that and begin to think maybe bodies aren't that bad. A couple other things began to happen. And in the Mediterranean, they got really good at trading, and they started to get more money. And so around Italy, they started to get a lot of money. And you may have heard of the Medici family. I call them Medici because that sounds more Italian to me, but I think you're supposed to say the Medici family. They got a lot of money, and so they started investing in art. And they actually decided that they were going to make their city, Florence, to be a piece of art in itself. So they invested in beautiful buildings and public sculptures and paintings, and they had really good taste. They also got their kin into the Pope's good graces. So they also, Uncle Charlie was a cardinal, and the other guy ran the bank. They kind of had a monopoly. But for art, it worked out okay. So we begin to see better things take place. And a huge revolution was they figured out they could paint with oils. Up till this point, they would actually mix the colors with egg yolk. So you can imagine that doesn't last very long. And then when someone said, hey, let's mix in some oils, we finally got some beautiful colors. So this kind of color, it's not looking that great on the screen. But this is a really, really rich colors. And I want to show you this piece. This is early Renaissance. And you can see, I don't know if you can see, his feet look really good there. Can you see his feet? They nailed the foot finally. It took like 1,000 years. Okay, so the other thing they started to do was use symbolism. You've probably studied symbolism in literature class. So here in the symbolism, it's the same system we have in literature. So the dog represents loyalty, and they have taken off their shoes like Moses did, so that means they're standing on holy ground. And there's one candle in that chandelier that's lit. And on the windowsill, there are some oranges, and she's wearing a green dress, and green makes us think of things that grow. So that would be a symbol of fertility. And you might not recognize this, but if you were in the Catholic Church back then, you would recognize this thing he's doing with his hand as the thing that the priests do. Is it a blessing? Does anybody know? I can't really see you anymore. But that was a specific to being a priest. So the name of this painting is called the Arnolfini Wedding Portrait. And it's not, this wasn't the wedding. He wasn't like an action painter going to the wedding. He staged this. So he had his friend come and stand right there, and another friend stand right there. It's hard to imagine life before photography, and it was much slower. So they posed, and he put all these things right where he wanted them because of symbolism. Now, I have kids in my class, Calvin will attest to this. I'll have kids in my class say, oh, that can mean anything to anybody. And I'll say, oh, your postmodernism is showing. But at this time, they all agreed that, yeah, we all kind of associate green with things that grow. And we all kind of associate dogs with being loyal. So this was just the way they communicated in art. It was accepted as a thing. So there's other symbols in there. I just wanted to show you the idea of symbolism goes way back. So you probably recognize this painting. So this is Da Vinci's Mona Lisa. And this is remarkable. It doesn't look remarkable to us. In fact, when I went to see it, it's in the Louvre. I went to see it, and it's actually smaller than you would think. It was like this big. And I was kind of underwhelmed, a little bit disappointed. And there's a big crowd of people around it, and they let you get real close to it. And so I'm like, don't you want to, and they're breathing on it, shouldn't they? In America, they'd like have barricades and police, and people are taking pictures, they don't care. So, but the thing that, if you can imagine a time before anybody had made the background blurry, this was amazing. So what happens with your eye when you look at things in the distance, out like you can see it the most like when you go to the mountains. The mountains farthest in the distance are a little bit fuzzier because of air. The air is actually building up and getting thicker and blocking your vision a little bit, making it blurry. So he captured that. And then he came in on her mouth. See the corners of her mouth do this? And it looks like soft and fleshy, and it's all like you could just touch, you just want to touch her because she's so alive. Remember the Madonna? She was very flat. So she's squishy, and those eyes, the thing about her eyes that was remarkable is that he didn't say, okay, give me happy. It's not exactly clear whether she's happy or sad. We don't know what she's thinking, but she is thinking something. Whereas before, it was very blank stare because they had to hold still for so long. So these are subtle things that Da Vinci did that nobody had done before. So that's why this is remarkable. And then everybody copied him, and it became nothing but a thing. The other thing he did was he blurred those edges. Before we had hard lines, and you would just outline like if I go to draw somebody, I draw their outline in black crayon, and then fill it in. So he's not about outline, he's about shape, and then he smoothed them out because that's kind of how our eyes work. We don't see those sharp outlines all the time. So there's a lot of beautiful things going on in this picture. This is the Last Supper. You probably recognize this. So what's remarkable about this, and again, they're not trying to be historical. This is probably not all what it actually looked like. But what they were in love with was geometry. And they got this from the Greeks. What happened was they went back to Greece and they started digging stuff up and going, hey, look at this cool stuff. We want to be just like them. And what the Greeks loved was geometry. There was a cult called the Pythagoreans. And if you disagreed with them, they would kill you. I am not joking. If you didn't believe in one of their theorems, that was it for you. So they were taking geometry very seriously. They believed it had some higher power. I don't think they believed that in the Middle Ages, but they did love some geometry. So do you see, this is called vanishing point perspective. So all the points in that painting are converging where? Right on Jesus. So that means something, right? Isn't he the beginning of all things? All things begin with him and go out. Didn't that painting just become a whole lot more meaningful when I pointed that out? So this is good stuff. All right, so this is Michelangelo's Pieta. The word Pieta means the pity, and so there were a lot of Pietas made, but this one is the most remarkable. Number one, because that is marble, and that looks like silk. That fabric, don't you just want to touch that fabric? It's so shiny and smooth and drapey, and it's a rock. Remember we were talking about rocks. So the other thing that's remarkable here is if you look at Jesus's body, look at that armpit. Do you see how that flesh has turned up because of the pressure of Mary's hand? That is so real. And the ribs in Jesus's body, and nobody had painted like this before because nobody really understood the human body. The reason Michelangelo, I already told Calvin the story, he could probably tell it back to you. The reason Michelangelo knew how to do that is because he would sneak into the basement of the, I want to say church, that's not the right word, the cathedral? It's not where the Pope lived, it's where the cardinal was. So if I say church, you think like little white church in the country. What I mean is more like a palace-y kind of thing, where you could go and get a meal, and you could spend the night, and lots of books were locked away there. So it's a big building, it's made out of stone. And if you were poor and you couldn't afford to bury your dead, you could bring your dead to them, and they would put it in the basement until they had time to go bury it. And they would just take care of that for you if you didn't have the money to do it the right way, or the way the rich people did. But the nice thing about that was that to touch a dead body would make you unclean. So they would wrap it up tight, put it in there, and then nobody would look at it again because they didn't want to touch it any more than they had to, so they would just take it and go bury it. Well, the cardinal knew that Michelangelo really had this passion for finding out what was inside a body. People who knew Michelangelo just knew that he was born to be a sculptor, and he had to be the best sculptor. He was so driven. And so he met with the cardinal a few times, and they would talk about books. And so the cardinal started putting a key in a book for a bookmark. And Michelangelo would go, that is weird, and go read the book and bring it back. This went on a few times before Michelangelo looked at that key and thought, I wonder what that key goes to. This might mean something. So the cardinal couldn't tell him it was okay. That would be wrong. But he could take that key and let himself in. He would dissect the bodies and then wrap them back up and put them back. And so this is how Michelangelo, because, some of you can hardly imagine a time where you can't just Google something. We could Google it, but that was like the ancient Google. You have to go do it yourself. So that's why that body looks so amazing. Someone asked Michelangelo why he didn't want to sculpt women, and he said, well, God made man first and then made woman from man, so the perfect body is a man's body. And so he sculpted only men. This is a sketch that Da Vinci made in one of his sketchbooks. And he is famous for sketching out ideas and writing about them and thinking things very deeply. The thing about Renaissance artists is that they were not just specializing in art. Michelangelo pretty much specialized in art. He said at one point he was regretful that he didn't study his Latin and his Greek better so that he could talk to all the scholars. But Da Vinci did. He knew his Latin and his Greek. He was classically educated. The shorts I added, that wasn't Da Vinci, just so you know. So Da Vinci's thinking, and again, these are guys who have a biblical worldview. That's why they drew pictures for the church. They were involved with the church. They believed in God. And Da Vinci is thinking about how man can be a spiritual being and an earthly being. Remember, we just got over a period where we thought we had to go live in a monastery because our flesh was so sinful that we hated it. And he's kind of coming to terms with this idea that we can have a body and we do live in the flesh, but we also have a spiritual side of us. So the circle, remember they love geometry, so the circle represents spiritual things. Remember, a circle it goes around and around and around with no end. So it represents things that are eternal. So those are spiritual things. And the square represents earthly things. I know, you'd think the circle would represent earth because it's round, but we haven't got there yet. They haven't figured that out. So the square represented earthly, fleshy things. And Da Vinci said, look, man fits perfectly within the circle. See how the outstretched arms and the spread legs touch the circle. But if man stands in a different pose with his arms like this and his feet straight down, he fits right inside a perfect square. So this is a perfect square and a perfect circle. And only man, the only creature that walks the earth, can do this and fit into both the square and the circle. So what he's saying through this picture is man is not an animal. Man is something more than an animal. Man is at once an earthly being and a spiritual being with a soul, because we have a soul and a body. So that's what this picture means. So this is huge. If you recognize that you are created in the image of God, and you have a soul, and you're a spiritual being, and yet you live on the earth, and you're not denying living on earth and being part of society, you can do amazing things. And that's why we have such beautiful things coming out of the Renaissance. So let me show you a couple more things that came out of the High Renaissance. I've messed up my preview here. In this picture, we've got a guy who looks like he's copying something. It's called St. Jerome, and we know that St. Jerome was known for copying the Bible. That's one of the jobs of the priests, and then that passed to monks, is that your paper would deteriorate over time, so you had to keep copying it over so that we wouldn't lose it. This is representing Martin Luther. We know this. I'm trying to remember the name. Who painted this? See my students? Dürer, right. This is also not a painting. I just said he painted it. He didn't paint it. This is an etching. So if you can imagine, he had to think opposite in his head and scrape out the white space from a piece of metal, cover it with ink, and then do a print of it. So this is a lot of brain work going on in here. This is very technical. And he achieved the most amazing thing. If you look at that window, see how the light is coming in and leaving shadows where those panes are on that window. That would be hard to draw with a pencil. And he was able to flip it and draw the reverse and then do a print of it. So that just amazes me right there. The society of the Renaissance valued technical sophistication above all else. Kind of like how we love our technology, how we love those really good Apple products. They loved really skillfully drawn things. So this guy represents Martin Luther, and the reason I know that is because Dürer wrote about it. Dürer lived in the area near Germany where Martin Luther was beginning to teach and talk about some things, and so this kind of represents Martin Luther. And Martin Luther had been a monk. He was very interested in spiritual things and wanted to do the right thing. So he joined the monastery, gave up all his earthly possessions, and he's copying the Bible. And one day he goes, "Hey fellas, I think we've translated this wrong. I think it should say celebrate, not celibate. So we should go tell the nuns." And they did. So that's a really brief description of the Protestant Reformation. But part of what he was teaching, and this began earlier with John Calvin and John Huss, but the idea that you don't have to ignore your body, that you can be a part of society, and your good works can serve God, and you can get married, and you can have kids, and you can be happy, and you can come out of the monastery. So this was huge, and everybody loved the idea. So they ran with it. There's also a lot of symbolism in here. In our class, we sometimes spend an hour just looking at one painting, and I get the kids to each tell me one thing that they see, and we talk about it, and that reminds them of something else, and we have a wonderful time. We can't do that tonight, but I hope you'll do that some other time. We have to go fast. So this is another painting that was inspired by Martin Luther's teaching. This is the first time we see ordinary tasks, and this is an ordinary girl. It's called The Milkmaid. She probably wasn't actually a milkmaid. She happens to be handling some milk. I think she's making bread pudding. But if you were to see the original of this, You would be amazed at the texture of that bread. And he drew that milk. I don't know if you can tell, but that milk actually comes out and it twirls because of the lip of that pitcher. And he captured that, and he captured how the light hits the milk as it's coming out. So he's finding beauty in everyday details of ordinary tasks. And that's not something that anybody would have valued up until Martin Luther pointed it out. And so he's saying, yes, this is beautiful. This is me homeschooling, me just cooking something wonderful, and the kids are off happily studying. And I think this is what homeschooling was going to be like. It's very romantic and beautiful, and the bread is crusty. It's really not like life at all, but maybe how we wish it were. So Vermeer is most famous for the yellows and blues, and the window on the left side. Some people think that that was done because he would set up in his studio kind of a light camera, early camera obscura. So he could build like a room within a room and punch a hole in the window and he could see the reflection. But even if he did that to help him paint some, he reached heights of texture and color that nobody else had done before. The brightness of that yellow and the brightness of the blue and the texture of that bread was really, really remarkable for the time. Again, we've never seen a photograph, so all this stuff is amazing. This is Rembrandt, and for the longest time, I couldn't really appreciate the beauty of Rembrandt. But this piece helps me understand why he is so loved. If you look at this man's eyes, you know this man had a soul, and you know this man was really alive. And I think he really captured that more than any other painting did. This guy is looking right back at you, and it's really intimate. And I think Rembrandt was trying to capture the soul of people when he painted. This is actually a self-portrait. He did a lot of self-portraits. Some people speculate it's because he couldn't afford a model. But he did have an interesting face to paint. And you can see how he aged because he painted himself over so many years. So this was a later one, of course. But this is why Rembrandt was amazing. So this is kind of, Rembrandt is actually considered a Baroque artist. I lumped him in there with the Renaissance because he still loved God, and he knew that a man has a soul. You can tell in his paintings. Shortly after that, we had a thing called the Enlightenment happen. Now this is where we get the word the Dark Ages. It was kind of like their slogan. It's kind of like you see some groups rephrasing things today to make something good sound bad. I can't think of any examples. Y'all probably can. So they said what we have, our beliefs, are the enlightened beliefs. And anything that happened before this period was dark because they hadn't been enlightened yet. So that's when they started calling the Middle Ages the Dark Ages, to kind of put them down and make their own philosophy look better. So the Enlightenment sounds really good and it draws people in, but it had some repercussions. The Enlightenment started to say that the monarchy is wrong. We shouldn't have a king rule over us. And maybe they were right in some ways. This is Louis XIV and Marie Antoinette. And they weren't really into being fair and gracious and compassionate rulers. They were really into their clothes and their house and accumulating wealth at the expense of others. So I kind of get that. I sure get that they didn't like the monarchy. But the other thing that the Enlightenment thinkers didn't like was that they didn't like the church telling them what to do either. And so they felt like they needed to get rid of church. And they started spreading those ideas and talking about them. At the same time as the Enlightenment thinkers were doing it, we also had neoclassicism in art arise. And that's when the painters started pulling in elements from the ancient Greeks again. So you see the columns. I didn't point it out there, but go back one. So do you see the, behind Louis XIV there, you see the base of a gold column and a big blue column. And behind Marie Antoinette on the right, you see another column. So artists are pulling in elements again from ancient Greece. So that's in France. And of course, England can't be outdone by France. It's kind of like the rivalry between State and Carolina. I don't like you, and if you were playing Duke, I would pull for Duke. So so England picks up the style. They don't want to be outdone, so they pick up some neoclassicism too, and yet they were welcoming the Protestant ideas into their culture. The French wouldn't have it. They would kill you if you got into Protestantism. So the Protestants fled. You might have heard of the Huguenots who had to flee. I'm sure we have some history experts in here. I may be butchering the stories, but I want you to do more research on it. So England has a revival of neoclassicism too. Well, let me back up a minute. So we were in England. England, King George colonizes America. The people who come to America bring Protestantism with them, the belief that there is a God. I'm not saying they were perfect. They got a lot of things wrong too. But they did keep the belief that man is made in the image of God. They brought it with them, and we can see in sculpture and in paintings that our founding fathers did pray. They brought with them the belief that God is sovereign and man is created in his image, but they also recognize that man is fallen. That's why they set up the 3 branches of government, to keep an eye on everybody. They know man is fallen. That's a key element. If you don't believe that man is fallen, then you're going to think way too highly of yourself. And that's kind of what happened in France. They didn't keep the belief that man is fallen. They began to think that man knew everything and had all the answers. And so they wanted to get rid of the king. They wanted to get rid of the church. They didn't want anybody telling them what to do. And they actually said, we're going to put reason on the throne. We're going to kick off the Pope, and we're going to kick off the king, and we're going to put reason. So this is an actress, and they dressed her up, and they said, okay, this is reason, and we're going to put her on the throne and parade her through the streets. So this is a symbol of a rejection of the church and God and the monarchy. So I think you probably know how this went. They did have reason rule for a little bit, but it shortly turned into the reign of terror, because if you have no basis for truth and you can use your reason to reason out anything, it very quickly turns to whatever I say is true and right, and if you disagree with me, I will kill you. So that's what they did. Shortly after that, Marie Antoinette herself goes to be beheaded. So now we have the whole world is turned upside down. She is no longer the queen. She's no longer sovereign. They no longer bow to her. They actually cut her head off. So if you don't use the Bible as the basis for what is right and what is wrong, and you decide that man is going to decide that, that sounds like a really good idea. It sounds like everybody's going to have their own personal freedom, but it can lead to one guy getting all the power, and then he decides that what's going to be best for society might not be so good for the individual, but it doesn't matter. He can reason it out, and reason now is king, so they go with what he says, and you end up killing a whole lot of people. So the reign of terror ended up in killing a lot of people in the church, all the nobles, and anybody who disagreed or anybody who was suspicious, they all got beheaded. Before you know it, they're back to having an emperor, and then they hated that, and then they ended up back with the king again. So the French Revolution was hugely unsuccessful in that they didn't end up with a different government at all. A lot of people died, and then they got rid of the church and ended up with a society that still didn't have God. The king came back, but God never did. In the U.S., though, we only got rid of the king, and we set up a reasonable government, and we didn't kick God out. We did, however, do some strange things with neoclassicism, like we built a lot of Roman temples. This is actually the Lincoln Memorial. See how much that looks like the Greek temple I showed you at the beginning? They put a rectangle on top instead of the triangle, and I don't really like that. It doesn't look right, does it? They didn't preserve the love of geometry. They preserved the love of important looking buildings. So they kept the columns, but lost a little bit of the beauty. This is another sculpture that I think is hilarious, and it's downtown Raleigh. You can go see this anytime. This is supposed to be George Washington, and he's dressed up like an ancient Greek philosopher. George Washington would have never done that. He would have never put that on. He was not a joking around kind of guy. So I think this is hilarious. But what they're trying to say is we're cool because we're neoclassicists. We know all about the ancient Greek statues, so we're going to dress up George Washington. And they're kind of saying he's a great guy by making him look like, he kind of looks like a Roman emperor. So they're saying, he's our top dog in a neoclassist way. So good things continued to happen in the U.S. We had westward expansion. That's what this painting is about, and it's beautiful, and it's optimistic. Then we have, this is The Gulf Stream by Winslow Homer, and this falls into a category of realism, and for the longest time I didn't believe it. I thought, no way are there going to be that many sharks right there in the water like that. I just didn't think that was real. And that downspout, I'm like, this is a tragedy. This is like Shakespeare in a painting. All these bad things happening, but I've heard that if you go to the Gulf Stream, and this was around Barbados, so evidently it really is like this. Does anybody know? Has anybody seen a scene like this with the fish that thick like that? I don't know, nobody. But evidently, so it's got a lot of action, and so a lot of my students are like, finally, some action happening. But the other thing I like about this is that he is in a bad spot. He is about to be eaten by sharks, maybe. They're pretty close. The mast is broken. There's a big wave coming. There's that water spout. And this would be the time to panic. But this guy is like, Jesus got the wheel. I am okay. He is strong. He's got sugarcane there, and he is not worried. He knows that he's going to ride this out, and it's going to be all right. So it's showing the strength and the resolve that he's a powerful man, and he is not panicked. And if you look up to the top left corner, do you see the ship? So that's a symbol of hope. So this painting is still, it may have been referencing the plight of the black man. It was about the time of the slaves were free and we're in Reconstruction, and the painter went to the Barbados area, so this is not African American man, but it kind of speaks to that time. And I think that there was a real optimism that the painter was trying to capture, that things are going to get better. He's been dealt a raw hand, but he's strong, and he's going to have a comeback. So that's what I love about this painting. This is also Homer, and this is a painting called Snap the Whip. Some of you who are going to teach Challenge 2, I'll tell you this. I thought, wouldn't it be fun if we went outside and we acted out this painting? So what you do is you hold hands and you run around and you try to sling the other boys off the end. You don't do this with 15-year-old boys because they will break each other's arms before they let go. This is definitely a young kid game. So I didn't have any broken arms that day, but it was close. I had to break it up because they take it way too seriously. I thought it was going to be fun, but it's not fun at all when you're 15. So don't do that. But this is a very optimistic time in America that I think this probably reminds you of other paintings you've seen where you're capturing happiness and simplicity of life. So I think because we kept God through our revolution, and we kept a fairly accurate idea of God is sovereign and man is made in God's image. It helped us to survive the revolution and rebuild and set up a functioning government and keep our optimism. Back across the pond on the other side, though, this is what's going on in France. Remember, they couldn't get it together. They kicked God out. Reason, turns out, isn't a great God herself. And so they're feeling fractured. If I were a real Southern girl, I'd say they're having a come apart. And that's what's going on here. This is a very fractured painting. It's beautiful, but things aren't held together. He has separated the colors and it's beautiful, but I think he does not want to look at what is really there. I think he only wants to look at the color and the light and separate himself a little bit from how bad things were. They were just, one of the writers described it, it was blood was flowing through the streets like a keg of wine had spilled. Can you imagine how if you had a big keg of wine break open and the wine just spilled out and would run into the cracks of the rocks in the road? Blood was running through the streets like that during the revolution. That's a lot to take in. That's a lot of stress on a society. And so I think the Impressionists didn't want to deal with reality. So they started just looking at things that were pretty, like light. It also coincided with scientific discoveries in optics and how the eyeball works and how the spectrum really works. So this was almost a scientific study in reflection and light and color. They were also really excited about the technological revolution and industrialization. Now, the Industrial Revolution usually gets a bad rap, but if we didn't have that, we wouldn't have shopping. So there must be something good about it. That's what I like. I like shopping, so it can't be all bad. But there were bad things that came out of the Industrial Revolution, but we haven't got to that yet. We haven't started to see it like that. They still see it as a wonderful thing. Everybody's excited about the steam engine and the factory and the idea of the assembly line. These are all wonderful new inventions. The bad side of that is that we fell in love with machines and people started saying, man is a machine. When I was a kid in the 70s, there was a Schoolhouse Rock song. Do you remember? Donna probably remembers. I'm a machine, you're a machine. It was so cute. Everybody's dancing. But the idea that I'm a machine denies that I have a soul. It denies that I'm going to heaven. If you're just a machine, you're not fully man anymore. So that's the downside of it. We did get some pretty things out of it, though. Monet's water lilies. He actually built this whole garden so that he could go back and paint it. So these are really big, too. I had looked at a lot of prints of this, and they came to the North Carolina Museum of Art, and I went to see it. I was expecting to see something like this size, but they are huge. So if you can imagine this, like double this size, it's just breathtaking. Sometimes he would find a round room and do them all the way around the room so that you would be just engulfed in water lilies. And they're just spectacular. So Monet is my favorite. Some of these paintings up here were inspired by Monet's. The green trees, that's a Monet that I copied. And the poppies, that's also a Monet that I copied. But I copy them not to cheat. So a modern art teacher would say I cheated. But I was learning how to do it by copying the masters. Now, you're so far away you can't see that. It is kind of fractured. Mine are too. So I had to learn how to look at a painting and say, well, that's green there, but what you've done is you've painted blue and yellow next to each other, and my brain puts them together. And then when I had to go paint that, in my brain I had to take them back apart and paint the blue and the yellow, and it would make green. So it was quite it's a tongue twister kind of for your brain to have to paint that. And so having gone through that process, I learned a lot. So that was a classical way to learn to paint. You would copy the masters. If you're in public school now, you probably don't do that in art class. In fact, I have a friend who's an art teacher in a public school, and she would never show a student another painting because that would be cheating. That would be giving them ideas, and that would be wrong. So I guess they have to reinvent the wheel every single time. So from there, one guy loved the Impressionists. He hung out with them, learned to paint like them, and then he took it a step further. So this is Van Gogh. So you can see he's not painting what he sees. The Impressionists were really trying to paint what they saw. They were really trying to paint the actual light and the actual reflection. And Van Gogh took it a step further, and he started painting things that he imagined, and that was a revolution. So he imagined these swirls in the sky. Some people might ask, was he on drugs? I get that question because I teach 15-year-olds. And the answer may be yes. He was put in a mental institution, and he would look out the window and he'd paint what he saw in the sky. And he was taking some drugs for that. So it could be that, or it could be that he actually saw things. Some people have recently detected some sound waves that actually do make these patterns. So there's a speculation that he did see things that were actually there that we don't see, or he was using his imagination. We're not really sure. But he was a tragic character. He may have been a little bit mentally unstable. He wanted to be a pastor, though. So his father had been a pastor, and his brother was a pastor, and he wanted to do the same thing. So he tried it out, and he was terrible. So the church asked him to stop. It's like, no, you're not cut out for preaching. Why don't you try being a missionary? So they sent him out to be a missionary. So he's like, he got there and he felt so compassionate for the people that he was supposed to be ministering to. He gave them everything. He gave them all his supplies and all his clothes, and he gave everything away. They're like, oh man, we got to bring it back. You didn't do that right either. So they couldn't find a place for him in the church. And because all of that fell through and he had nothing else to do, his brother took care of him. His brother kind of paid his bills and let him paint. And he never got any money for any of his paintings. He did finally sell one painting, and he died shortly after. And his death was a tragedy, too. Some people say he committed suicide. He died from a bullet wound in the stomach. Now, if you were going to commit suicide, you wouldn't shoot yourself in the stomach, no matter how crazy you are. That's not right. So the thing is, they didn't have, CSI. Yeah, that wasn't a thing. So they didn't investigate his death. They just were like, oh, you shot yourself, and you took a week to die, and they buried him, and that was it. There was no investigation. But people went back later and started interviewing people who'd heard stories, and it turns out there were some boys who were playing with a gun near where Van Gogh was. He was kind of the village odd guy, and they think the boys may have shot him, but he didn't tell anybody because he was so compassionate towards the boys. So he was a very tender-hearted man, and he did die a terrible death. But he left some of the most beautiful paintings. He's one of my favorites too. So 3 of the paintings behind me are inspired by Van Gogh. And it's fun to paint like Van Gogh. And he launched a movement called Expressionism, where you begin to express yourself. So that was a beautiful time in art where people began to try to express themselves. Before that, they were trying to copy reality or try to communicate something subtle, but now this really unleashed a movement where you would try to express yourself. This is what most modernists or people in our culture think art is all about, but it just started with Van Gogh. So it's a fairly new idea. This is an important guy, Picasso. You've probably heard of Picasso, and most people look at that and go, ooh, I didn't like that at all. And I think that's exactly what he wanted you to say. So the story behind this is that he was a Spaniard. He grew up in Spain, but if you were serious about being an artist, you don't stay in Spain. You got to go to France, where all the big guys are, and you got to hang out where they are. Once again, we don't have Google Hangout or social media, so you have to go where they are. So he had left his home. He's living in France, and the Spanish Revolution happened. So you have an authoritarian regime there. That was actually, some of you could probably tell this story better. There's a revolution. The rebels are trying to get their freedom, and the government in power makes friends with Germany, who's trying out this new thing called their Nazi plane. They had just invented these planes, and they had this new way of waging war, and they would make these lines. They would go up and down, so they would bomb a city. To bomb a city correctly to them, you would bomb all the roads and bridges that led into a city, and then you would go back and forth like this, very systematically, back and forth to destroy everything. And then when you're done doing that, you would go back and forth like this, or they would quadrant it off. And so this was like this huge revelation, this wonderful invention. And so the Spanish government said, hey, come down and use your new technique on this city, and we'll stop this revolution. And that happened to be Picasso's hometown. And this painting was done the day after he read about it in the newspaper, and he was devastated. And so what he's trying to say here is this: look what technology has done to my home. People have been torn apart. There's the bull that represents Spain. There's people who are fragmented now, and things have come apart, and they are suffering. And that's what this painting says. So it's very powerful in its message, but it's not beautiful because it's not a beautiful message. He was trying to get your attention. This is a mural. It's very big. This is very striking and powerful. So it was a confusing time. I think I mentioned already, there was one school year last year where we had, it seemed like so many tragedies happening at once. And the day we were looking at this painting was a day that we had been recently talking about a school shooter. And so I asked the students, if you were going to paint the painting and you were going to replace some of that symbolism, think about what you would put in it. And so they said, well, we'd have to replace the bull with an American eagle, and there would be some guns, and it would be a school. And we just talked for a long time about that and began to identify with how Picasso felt at that time. So this painting is relevant today, even though at first we looked at it and we're like, ooh, I don't want that. So art becomes not something that's done just for beauty. It's done to reach down in your soul and get a reaction and speak to you like that in a emotional level. This painting is Jackson Pollock's. It's called Lavender Mist. So a lot of the culture had put, this is an American, so we're back in America now. You know, we loved our technology and we loved science, and we believed that through science, we're going to solve all mankind's problems. We're going to solve hunger if we just knew the right science. So we put all our faith in science. And then World War II happened, and then the atomic bombs happened. The atomic bombs were like the ultimate science project, and we achieved it, and we were so proud of it, and we spent so much money. We were all driving for it. And then they saw what it did, and it turned a whole town to ashes. And I think Jackson Pollock and a lot of people felt like we put our faith in technology and science, and look what it got us. Therefore, we're going to reject everything that we had put our faith in. We're going to reject all that church stuff. We're going to reject all the government stuff. We're going to reject all your traditions because they've led us to nothing but ash. And so what do you paint when you've rejected everything? You've rejected the geometry and you've rejected the techniques. So this is what you paint when you reject everything. So this represents like a loss of hope. They had nowhere to go. If you don't know God and you don't know you have a soul and you've put all your faith in science, and science leads you to a nuclear bomb that's likely going to destroy the whole world, he was very shook up. So I feel compassion for Pollock. It was odd the way he was received. People thought he was amazing. He thought he'd made this a great breakthrough. I think they all felt this desire to reject the past and to reject tradition. Now, in music, it birthed jazz. Jazz was a rejection of structure and a rejection of tradition, but it wasn't quite so hard to take. It's beautiful, although there are Jackson Pollock paintings that have some beauty in them, but he wasn't going for beauty. That wasn't on his to-do list. So where does art go from there? And I think Andy Warhol said it the best. He said, art is whatever you can get away with. And so that led to artists trying to get away with all kinds of things. And that it led to trying to shock the audience and to just get some kind of emotional reaction from anybody at all. So it led to some pretty weird stuff. Now, I kind of think these are cute, but we don't have the beauty. They're not even trying for the beauty that they saw in the Renaissance. Shortly after that, we got to the rock in the art museum. So this is the actual rock that is in a museum in LA. They spent $10 million on this art installation. They got that money from donors. So somebody convinced a lot of old ladies that this was art, and she bought into it. And this girl's like, yay, art. I don't know what art is. So now we're back to here. So it's not sculpted, it's not polished, it's just a rock. And this is called art, and people are writing articles about how it's an amazing sculpture. It's called one of the most iconic artworks of the past 5 years in LA Times, and people are really celebrating it. They're not making fun of it. To give them credit, though, they did put it up so you could see the underside of it. So there you go. That's what makes this rock special. You can see under it. So this is where we are today. People believe that this is art. They have done nothing. It took no skill. There is no beauty. And I think we could sum this philosophy up as postmodernism. Postmodernism is a rejection of any truth at all. Whatever's true for you is true for you. You might have heard that before. You can define your own truth, which sounds like it's going to be really freeing, but it's just like what happened in the French Revolution. As soon as you give if man is the ultimate source of truth, man is going to decide whatever he wants to decide, and he can use reason to back it up. So I've made a little diagram. I just made this yesterday. I'm still working it out. It might not be perfect. But if you look along the bottom, you've got time going to the right there, so you see the Egyptians. And then up the side, I just made this up. I didn't get this from anybody else, so it could be wrong. Y'all tell me if you think this is a bad idea. So the value up high is what we value most, and down low is what we hate. So if you see the Egyptians, they valued their man-made gods. And man was really, most men, Pharaoh, he was a god. But every common people, they were really just like ants. They were there to build the pyramids for the Pharaoh. So there, I put man very low. And man is just short for mankind. I include women too. So then the Greeks started to think that man was pretty amazing. All this geometry and philosophy, they loved man, but they still had their man-made gods. I don't really think they really believed in them. I think they just went along with it. Then in the Middle Ages, they thought, man's earthly body's pretty bad, but we still love God. And then in the Renaissance period, that's when we began to think, hey, man's pretty cool. Man's amazing. Man can do anything. So man goes up, and then I put the Vitruvian man up there. So there is a period there where we had a right view of God and a right view of man, and that's when we produced the most beautiful stuff during the Reformation, the Renaissance, and the American Revolution. And then when we introduced neoclassicism and the Enlightenment, we started to think too highly of man, and we began to put man on the pedestal, and we took God off. And then God quickly dropped. Whoa, he got going there with the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. And then man began to get more highly esteemed because we're prideful, we do that. But what we're seeing in postmodernism is that we don't even like man anymore, and man has no value. So if nothing has any value and there is no beauty, then why isn't a rock art? We have no basis for beauty, and we have no basis for truth. So anything can be art, and nothing is art. So I put beauty on the scale. This is not a beautiful chart. It's not beautiful, so it needs to be beautiful. It's kind of ugly now. I need to work on that. But you can see this is the rise and decline of Western cultural history that Francis Schaeffer talks about in his books. So beauty is a function of truth. So the civilizations that got it right, that knew truth, that knew the one true God, and had a right view of man, produced the most beautiful stuff. Breathtaking, beautiful things. And then the societies that had it flipped produced terrible things. So the question for us is, how can we be the Renaissance man in a postmodern world? How can we be both spiritual and earthly and yet not get sucked into what the culture says? So I want to say to the young people, don't be a lemming. Don't follow the crowd and do whatever they say is cool, because they might be very wrong. So first, Romans 12:2 says, "Do not be conformed to the pattern of this world." I think that's what he's saying. He's saying, don't go along with the crowd. You got to think it through, and you got to remember the one true God and have a right view of man. You don't want to think too highly of yourself. Man's not perfect. Man has fallen and sinned. That's why we have checks and balances, right? That's why we have forgiveness, and we know that our friends and our spouses make mistakes, and we forgive them. And yet, we also know that we're not just animals, we're not accidents of slimy algae. We're something more. We're made in the image of God.